listen for a second to wait for the system to tell me that we are recording now, and you should see it as well. You are recording this meeting. So very good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We had few apologies. People are flying, and one of those apologies is our president. Mark O'Neill is flying as we speak, so unfortunately he will not be with us. I've got a little agenda to tell you what was happening over last month, actually, because we didn't have our meeting for a month. August is busy for people to take holidays, and therefore, let me bring you up to speed. First of all, Ukraine. So there is a good news as far as seafarers are concerned. Ukrainians are now allowed to leave country. And when I say Ukrainians, I mean male 18 to 60. There was a lot of issues surrounding this, and we have been working together with representative of trade unions in Ukraine, and they did prepare a very good procedure, which I have circulated to all of you. Some of you encountered issues, and therefore, if you do have a hands-on experience with your Ukrainian seafarers leaving country, by all means, drop me a line, tell me precisely what is the problem, and we will work together with fellow organizations. It's very good to remind you that we are all in it. So Intertanko, Intercargo, BIMCO, ICS, InterManager, we are all pulling the resources together and working together. Therefore, we are a formidable force. And I'm fairly confident we can do anything you want us to do. I'm delighted to tell you that InterManager submitted a commenting paper to Chinese intervention on enclosed spaces. We had pretty good support from our organizations, fellow organizations as well. And Captain Paddy McKnight will be representing InterManager on CCC, which starts shortly this week. I will be sending message to the bondholders of shipping KPIs shortly. Those of you who know what I'm talking about will probably nod their heads and say, oh, very good, thank you. We should be doing that within probably next week. I have sent a message last week regarding 2 Irish cadets, and believe it or not, we are still not getting any sea time for them. Therefore, please, 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 we really need our younger fellow seafarers to go to sea and gain some experience. And without you and me, it will not happen. So please come back to me and offer 2 spaces for the electrical cadets. We really need ETOs. And if we don't provide this time now, then we will not have electricians next year and so on. And let me be cynical here. Allegedly, we've got shortage of seafarers. And every time I provide you with seafarers, nobody wants to take them. So do we really have a shortage of seafarers, or we are just BSing ourselves? And standards. Mark is stepping up now and promised to work final versions of our new standards. And they should be with us shortly. They have been circulated with the drafting committee. Drafting committee made comments, and we are working together. And I'm very pleased to see a representative and member of InterManager here, RightShip, because they have done a lot of work on this, and it would be good to actually provide feedback to RightShip as well. If you remember, we were circulating the checklist, and I did receive some comments, and I would love to receive even more, so we can pass on and work together with RightShip on this checklist for the well-being of seafarers. That's all from me. Are there any questions? Is there any issue you would like to raise? Then please use your yellow electronic hand. Nothing so far. Okay, therefore, well, we all know Hill Dickinson, and we all know from my message Beth and Rachel, who are, thank you very much, with us today, because there is another extremely important and topical issue, which is EU ETS. And my concern, my serious concern, which wakes me in the middle of the night, is the fact that third-party ship managers' interests are not really addressed. And if we InterManager don't do anything on that, then we are not going to get anything. Therefore, please participate in this discussion today. Grill Beth and Rachel. They will prepare something for us, but otherwise, I've got at least 7 or 8 questions, but we need more. And I think we definitely have European Union listening. They are happy for us to talk to them, but we need to come back with solid facts. We need to ask them right questions, and maybe even better, tell them what would make us happy. If it is in line with what they are expecting, then we might get it. Enough of me saying I took 5 minutes of your time. Beth and Rachel, I don't know which one of you is going first. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cuba, and thank you. We're very grateful for the invitation to come and speak to you today in relation to the EU ETS and its potential impact on ship management agreements. I'm a partner in the shipping team at Hill Dickinson, and I'm joined by one of our senior associates, Rachel Hoyland, who alongside me has been over the last 18 months or so publishing insight and providing webinars and seminars to our client base in relation to the regulatory changes that are on the horizon for shipping in terms of decarbonisation and the maritime industry's need to find a means by way to decarbonise, some of which is very much in the future given where the targets are at present for decarbonisation, and some of which is a lot more imminent. We do not need to discuss today the IMO's regulations that come into force in January, because those relate, I think, largely to ship owners, although I'm sure as technical managers you will be being troubled by trying to work through the EEXI and CII regulations and what they mean and how they are to be implemented. Today we're going to focus solely on the latest draft proposal from the EU for adding maritime to the EU emissions trading scheme, and we're going to go down the rabbit hole to try to work out the effect that will have on ship managers and comment really on what ship managers should be looking at in terms of their existing contractual arrangements with owners to ensure that they are fully up to speed with how they may be caught by the regulation if it comes into effect in its present draft, and to make sure that the contracts are all in order so that there are no nasty surprises there. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Rachel, who will outline what the most recent proposal says and what the consequences for non-compliance are likely to be. I will come back towards the end to talk about the contractual areas that may need attention from a ship manager point of view.
Lovely, thank you very much, Beth. And I've just pulled up some slides which will be helpful to perhaps for you to be able to see them while I'm speaking. So hopefully everyone can see those. If you can't, then just let me know. As Beth said, we'll talk through this in two parts. I'll go through talking about the EU emissions trading scheme first, and then we'll dive in to look a bit more about the impact on ship management relationships. And I'm going to guess that the level of awareness is probably quite high in this audience, but so that we are starting from the same point, I'm just going to speak really quickly about what is the EU ETS, why do we need it, and also how does it work. So the EU emissions trading scheme is a scheme to drive the reduction of harmful greenhouse gases down within the EU and now on voyages into and out of the EU. It's an important initiative for the EU, although it's been up and running since 2005. It's become increasingly a tool that the EU is deploying to address climate change, and as the UN's described it, the code red situation for humanity because of uncontrolled global warming and the sort of damaging consequences of that. Now, how does it work? Essentially, it imposes a cost on emissions that fall within the scheme. So it's creating an incentive to reduce emissions. And this is through a cap and trade scheme whereby allowances for emissions are issued by the EU, and an allowance is like a permit to produce 1 tonne of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas equivalent within an annual period. And the EU requires the acquisition of allowances and then the surrender of allowances. So that's where the cost comes in, because you have to buy those allowances. But it's not just a sort of problem you can buy your way through, because year on year the number of allowances available reduces. So the cap is continually being reduced. So the industry has to reduce its emissions as well as pay for them as it goes. So the legislation that we're looking at the moment is draft legislation, as Beth said. This hasn't yet been fully approved and enacted by the EU. We're currently on to the third proposal, so we might say we're maybe quite close to the final version, but equally each version has had some fairly significant changes so far. But as things stand, this will impact from the 1st of January 2024 onwards, so emissions produced from that date onwards. The emissions that are captured are carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, which is a wider net than previously. It was just carbon dioxide, but the inclusion of methane now means this will affect the LNG fleet as well. And this comes from, as I said, 1st of January. So for ships of 5,000 gross tonnes and over, the scheme initially catches 100% of emissions on voyages intra-EU and in EU ports, and then it's 50% of emissions on voyages coming in and out of the EU. The scheme is widened then a bit from January 2027 when it applies to smaller ships, so 400 gross tonnes and over. Still 100% of emissions in the EU and imports in the EU, but then it goes up to 100% of emissions on voyages into or out of the EU, subject some situations where certain conditions apply. So that's roughly what's being captured by the scheme and the timeframes in which it will apply. The interesting question, and I think this is where it really starts to draw in ship managers, is who's the responsible party in this situation? Who has to submit these allowances? Well, this is defined in the legislation as shipping companies. And I've put the definition up on the slide, and there are kind of 3 elements to this definition, which are the parts I've highlighted in green. So the shipping company could be the ship owner, first of all, and it may be relatively straightforward in that case, but the shipping company may also be any other organisation or person, and you'll see that the manager is particularly identified there as someone who might fit this. So it's an organisation or person who's assumed responsibility for the operation of the ship from the ship owner and has agreed to take over the duties and responsibilities imposed by the ISM code. So if you're dealing with the technical management of the ship, it's likely that you're going to fulfill that definition, and it will be managers who are the shipping company, meaning it is upon managers that the new regulatory obligation falls. One way of perhaps determining this, as well as working through the 3 points in the definition, would be just to look to the document of compliance and the safety management certificate and see who is named there, because it will be that party. So here's a regulatory obligation that may fall on managers, and there's actually another obligation which may fall on managers from a contractual point of view. So as well as creating obligations for shipping companies, the rules also set up an opportunity for a new contractual obligation to fall on an entity other than the shipping company. So if you are the shipping company, this obligation doesn't fall on you. But if you're not the shipping company, say you're just doing the commercial management of the ship, you might be caught not by the regulatory obligation, but by this contractual obligation. And this relates to who pays for the costs of compliance. So you might have owners or technical managers there dealing with the actual compliance, but then who is it who's going to pay for that? And this provision came out of lobbying by representatives of the ship owning community who wanted to be able to have a kind of legislative basis to pass those costs down the chain. And I think this was really intended to work in the charter party, but where managers are doing commercial management, it seems likely that managers may also fall within this definition. And the key points of the definition are it's the party with ultimate responsibility for the purchase of the fuel or the operation of the ship pursuant to a contractual arrangement. And in this context, then operation of the ship means determining the cargo carried or the route and speed of the ship. So I'll just park the contractual aspect there for the moment. I'm going to come back to this regulatory obligation, which is all about the submission of allowances to match the emissions that fall within the scheme. So on whomever that obligation falls, they need to submit allowances by the 30th of April in the following year for the emissions for the preceding year. Now, to submit allowances, you're going to have to acquire them first, and there are 3 ways of doing that. They can be acquired by way of auctions from member states. They can be acquired by trade and transfer in the market, or there's a new provision which enables a shipping company to become a member of the Ocean Fund, which is something administered by the EU, and the Ocean Fund then deals with the submission of allowances. All of this is kind of governed by the administering authorities, and that essentially means the member states. So if you are a shipping company and you're registered in a member state, your administering authority is that member state. If you fall within the definition of shipping company and you're not within the EU, then your administering authority is the member state where you've had the most port calls previously. So they will become the entity which regulates and kind of governs and deals with your obligation to submit allowances into the scheme. Of course, in the event of non-compliance, there are penalties. The first of those is that administering authorities is to ensure the publication of names, so there's some reputational risk here. The second are excess emissions penalties, so think of these as fines, and these apply on a per tonne basis for emissions produced in excess of the allowances that are submitted. And then there are some perhaps more penetrative penalties. So if there's non-compliance for a period of 2 years, ships can be expelled from member state ports, and they can also be detained in member state ports. So some fairly serious penalties there, ones which might in the first instance perhaps impact the owners more, but I think commercially they would certainly impact ship managers as well. And of course the first two penalties, the publication of names and the excess emissions penalty, they may fall very directly on ship managers. So something to be aware of there. So looking at how this now impacts the ship management relationship, I'm going to hand on to Beth for her comments.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, I have attempted to reduce at least my initial thoughts on how this impacts potentially on the ship management contracts in general terms, because you will have slightly different contracts and agreements that you're dealing with, to one slide, which I hope is useful, or at least provides a useful starting point for the discussions. I think there are two issues that are at least clear from the presentation that Rachel has given so far. First, the addition of maritime to the EU emissions trading scheme is going to impose greater costs on shipping within the EU and intra-EU. It also is going to result in a greater administrative burden, whether that falls on the ship owners or on their ship managers. There is going to be a lot of work that will be needed to be done to collect in the relevant data in relation to emissions, some of which will be familiar because they are used in the EU MRV system as a starting point to calculate the emissions for each year that this applies, but that will be an administrative task, and then of course the tasks of acquiring and then surrendering the allowances at the relevant time. So there's quite a bit there that needs to be considered in terms of the practical operation of shipping once it is added to the ETS. So there are two routes through which ship managers may become involved in the EU ETS scheme. The first is the direct route for technical managers, owing to the definition of what is considered to be a shipping company for the purposes of the EU ETS. And so where you are in a position of providing the technical management for owners and are discharging their ISM responsibilities, and also to a certain extent where you've also discharging the owner's responsibilities to the flag states, those managers that fall squarely within the responsible party definition for who is or which entities will be looked at by the EU for compliance. What to do in terms of the contractual situation as a technical manager in that position, I think it boils down to one of two choices, either between you and your owners, you agree contractually not to be the responsible party, Now that works on a contractual basis. It takes you out of the picture in terms of administering the scheme and obtaining and surrendering the allowances. But what it will not do is remove you as technical managers from the scope of the definition of shipping company. So it's only a partial answer to where the regulatory burden falls. In terms of risk, I mean, there is an potential exposure there. I would have thought the regulators would look first at the owners for compliance and then drop down to the rest of the definition if they're getting nowhere with the owners. But where you've excluded the scope of the EU ETS from what you are agreeing to take on as technical managers, then there ought to be a defence there in terms of any regulators who come knocking at your door, but also you would look to be included in that exclusion, an indemnity from those owners such that they will be agreeing to discharge the regulatory burden appropriately, and if they don't, that they will indemnify you if the regulators come knocking at your door fully for all your costs and any associated fines. So exclusion on a contractual basis is an option. Or at least contractually it is. It may not commercially be an option, depending on what your relationships are and what the owners are asking you to do. The alternative is to dovetail it in with the definition and to take on the contractual responsibility for being the responsible party under the terms of the EU ETS. Now, the contractual changes would need to be made there in order to clarify exactly the scope of what it is as technical managers you are taking on, including, really importantly, what happens with the costs of compliance to ensure that you're not being left with the costs and you're able to claw those back from either the owners or from the charterers for the costs of obtaining and surrendering allowances, and also the costs of any administration fees which you will be incurring in trying to deal with the kind of paperwork aspect of operating the scheme. The position gets a little more complicated, I suppose, if there is ownership, technical managers, and then another commercial manager, because then there will need to be provisions in the technical management agreement where you're operating the EU ETS that allows you then to look to the commercial manager for the cost, so you are able to reclaim the costs for them, or that owners will reclaim it and make you good in the middle there. So provisions there would need to be dovetailed. And I think also it's really important to look at any budgetary provisions that you have in the technical management agreement, because if you are taking on the responsibility of obtaining the allowances, there will be a cost to those allowances, and those costs are likely to fluctuate because the allowances are going to be tradable. And so at least year one, it's going to be difficult to know what the costs of the allowances are going to be. After a few years, those costs may settle down and it may all commercially get rolled up into the kind of higher or freight rates that the owners are claiming for their vessels. But at least to begin with, there needs to be a mechanism if the cost of obtaining the allowance goes up and it exceeds the budgeted amount, for you as technical managers to go back to the owners to say this budget isn't enough, we need more, and here are the documents substantiating that. So there needs to be a bit of flex in there to cover that commercial position off, as well as again, importantly, trying to accurately assess what the administration cost to you as the technical manager is going to be to fulfill the obligations on behalf of the owners, and because it seems to me that particularly where there is a large fleet that is doing a lot of business into and within the EU, that the simple administration of working out what the emissions are, what the appropriate level of allowances are, obtaining them, surrendering them at the right time, it's going to be quite a bit of additional paperwork. So those are my initial thoughts on the areas that need to be looked at in terms of the technical management agreement in order to use the contract to do the heavy lifting for you in terms of what you're agreeing to do, who's going to pay the cost, and how you're going to recoup that cost, and to make sure that where you are providing that service, you are doing so in an appropriate way. The other route that's been highlighted is this slightly curious provision that was inserted in the most recent draft of the proposal, which came about through lobbying from ship owners looking to have some form of regulatory basis to put provisions in probably their chartering contracts to enable them to recover the costs of the emission allowances from the charterers as the ultimate users of the vessels who are ultimately creating the emissions. It impacts, and it is a really curious provision, and we could debate it endlessly about how well it will work if it is carried through. Certainly from an English law point of view, that there is a debate to be had about whether it has any effect at all if the contractual provision isn't inserted into any of the relevant contracts, but that is for another day. But the way this proposal works, and as Rachel put up on one of the earlier slides, is that it seeks to impose a contractual opposes a contractual obligation to impose the costs of compliance on the party who is responsible for them. It's intended for charterers, but because of the definition, including those who are involved in the supply of bunkers to the vessel or taking decisions over the employment for the vessel, it can also, we think, be capable of catching commercial managers in the sense that where they are obtaining the supply of bunkers for the fleet or taking employment decisions for the fleet, they may come within that provision. So it's a slightly different route. It's about where the cost should fall as opposed to who discharges the regulatory burden, and it's a very, very odd provision. So what to do there? Again, as a commercial manager, you can agree to exclude it in your agreements with owners. If it would be appropriate to do that in circumstances where, as a commercial manager, you are going out into the market and you're finding opportunities for the fleet, but the ultimate decision for the employment of the vessel sits with owners, and it is owners' name that goes into the charter parties, and so all the contractual terms imposing these costs down the shipping line should fall on the ultimate charterer. And so in that situation, it would be appropriate to try and exclude that any cost aspect from you as the commercial manager, because it should flow down the chartering chain. Of course, in that situation, you would be looking to get indemnities to protect you, such that owners are agreeing that if anybody came knocking at your door to pay the costs of the scheme, that you have a right of recourse under your management contracts to the owners themselves. Alternatively, you can agree to be the responsible party for the costs on a contractual basis, but in that situation you would also want to ensure that as part of the chartering arrangements you are also the party named in the charter party and are able to include back-to-back provisions in the chartering terms, so that contractually it bounces from owners, the cost bounce from owners, the technical to the commercial managers, and then on to charterers, so that it goes down the line and you are in a position to gather in the costs that this will impose. So it's just there about dovetailing the contractual position in terms of where the costs are going to fall. How the scheme is going to operate itself is, I would say, at best hazy in terms of its practical operation. BIMCO have produced a clause which is to an extent instructive, or at least instructive of the committee, the concerns of the committees looking at the emission trading schemes in general and the EU one in particular, about where or how that committee has looked at carving up the responsibility and cost aspects between owners and time charterers. And I think that was a clause released earlier this year. It's quite a good starting point, but it's quite involved. It involves a lot of data transmission between the owners and the time charterers, and allowances being transmitted back towards the owners on a regular basis, so that they have sufficient allowances to cover the position on an annual basis. So where you are involved in the chartering, of vessels and the employment of vessels on the owner's behalf as commercial managers, it is worth a look at those clauses to see whether they're appropriate to be used, and to ensure that those provisions are mirrored as well within your commercial management agreement, to make sure that that contractual nexus flows all the way through, so that you have the ability to collect in the costs if that is the role that you were taking on behalf of the owners. So, as I say, those are my initial thoughts on how managers, both technical or commercial managers, to the extent that they're separate or amalgamated, if that is the position, are caught. I don't think there's any aspect of the EU ETS that impacts if you are simply dealing with crewing management. I think in that situation, this is totally irrelevant to you. We have many other issues to deal with. So those are the initial thoughts on the way the EU ETS may impact technical and commercial ship managers. And I will pass quickly back to Rachel with some concluding thoughts for you.
Thank you, Beth. So I'm just going to pull the slides down. So concluding points, there's quite a lot here to get to grips with potentially. But there's a real opportunity here, because if you do get to grips with it, then you have the opportunity to differentiate yourself and perhaps obtain a commercial advantage by being particularly good at this. And because it's new, because it's a bit complex, that stands as an opportunity to be seized, alongside the other opportunities that flow from, and we can talk about them in a bit more detail if you want, the EEXI, CII, decarbonisation generally. So I'm thinking there about the expertise that some managers have in relation to efficient operating of the vessel, retrofitting of vessels, moving into an alternative fuels future as well. So there's some new headaches to be grappled with, but these also deliver new commercial opportunities for managers. And I think on that note, we'll close our comments there, and very happy to discuss and to answer any questions that you might have.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very good slides. I really like them. They are being recorded, so they are staying with us now. So thank you. Very good, and very short as well. That's very important, and we just hit the ground. I've got several, and I'll start with them, hoping that our audience will warm up as well and will put the hands up. The very first was directly to Hill Dickinson. Are you guys actually seeing third-party members, our members, coming to you now and asking for assistance in discussing contractual obligations with very difficult situations at times? I can see from my point of view, for example, very often owner is the head of everything, and then it branches out. So third-party management is contractual based with owner, crew is with owner, and then commercial is with owner. Therefore, me being third party, I'm going owner, then owner goes to commercial. I've got no direct dealings with commercial. Now, this I could have said, fine, I was very happy with it. However, now, and I'm hearing what you are saying, I need to start thinking about this connection here, or maybe this connection, to ensure that this connection is very clearly defined, and I'm either out of the game, or if I'm in a game, I know my obligations. So my question to you is, are you seeing my members approaching you now, and you've got a long queue and you can only talk to them in December because you've got hundreds of them waiting for appointments?
No, is the short answer. We have dealt with a number of queries from owners and also time charterers, where wording for the EU ETS has been sought to be negotiated, and it's all relatively new and nobody really knows how it's quite going to operate on a practical basis, which makes drafting an appropriate clause challenging. It's doable, but ship managers, no. And I think it's probably, and it's by no means a criticism, I think it is natural, and particularly for owners as well, it is natural to see regulatory changes as something that will be dealt with on another day. And if we bear in mind the last couple of years, there have been all sorts of challenges facing the maritime community. We've had the change in fuels, which was rapidly overtaken by all of the stresses and strains caused by the pandemic, which is by no means resolved. And then decarbonisation. I mean, everybody knows it's going to happen, but another day, another day, another day. And I think we're getting very close, particularly through the IMO regulations, to implementation. The EU ETS has been, I think this is the second or third year it's been kicked off by a further year. So there is, I would say there is time to sort it out, and to, you know, a year is a good enough amount of time to renegotiate or start looking at wording. But definitely on the EEXI and CII, we've got a couple of months, and you know, again, it's very, very slow on the kind of contractual side for people kind of warming. I mean, to start to look seriously at their contracts, and bearing in mind a lot of them will be long-term positions that are being entered into, where you're 3 months off implementation. That's very late in the day to leave it, but a year is, you know, is a good time to start looking at and thinking about and discussing.
Well, it's very interesting that you are trying to play that low, I would say, in my opinion, maybe because I'm just a panicky creature. It's 3 months as far as I'm concerned, and if we do not position ourselves rightly now, then in a year time we may say, oh, I wish I did this and that, because it will disadvantage me in 15 months. So that's my question. I'm actually seeing the same as you do, very little interest. And all our discussions, third-party ship managers in discussions are pretty, well, we don't know yet. We haven't seen it's all draft at the moment. Let's wait for the final, and so on and so forth, which is very good point, absolutely. But my next question is shipman. We will obviously be talking to BIMCO more on that, but are you seeing anything being done on shipman, for example, between, you know, contractual between the owners and managers being implemented in a shipman, BIMCO shipman?
Again, no, very, very quiet. I mean, and shipman would be an excellent place to start inserting clauses which are appropriate to deal with this, but also the EEXI and CII. I think it's the focus really, it seems to me, has been on kind of owners and charterers position for EEXI. CII is still pending, and even though it's very soon to be implemented, there still isn't a proposed clause that maps it all out from BIMCO. And I think that, you know, and I can well understand the difficulties there, because it's just a very odd piece of regulation. I can understand what it's intended to do, but it's very, very disruptive in terms of the contractual way in which maritime business is done. And then with the ETS clause that came out, I think earlier this year, I mean, I think it's, once you look at where the draft proposal is from the EU ETS, it rapidly becomes clear quite where the issues are for particularly technical managers, because they are caught within the definition of shipping company. So they have the obligation, or one of the entities that will have the obligation. But I think, you know, I think there has just been so much going on. Plus, okay, it's draft, so we don't need to worry about it. The point is, we're due to hear, I think, this month about whether the latest draft is approved or whether there'll be a further iteration. But if it's approved this month, then that's it, and we've got 15 months to try and resolve all of these problems in a way that's appropriate in terms of the contractual arrangements that you have, including that if you've got several different parties dealing with different aspects of the management of the vessel, some work is going to need to be done to make sure that that technical manager, commercial manager, charterer aspect, because it all goes back to the owners in a triangle, is dealt with contractually, because you can't hop over, at least as a matter of English law. There'll be privity of contract, so there'll need to be provisions. I mean, they're draftable, and we see them all the time in chartering contracts. So, you know, the time charter agrees with certain clauses in its any voyage charter that's entered into, who also agree to insert certain clauses into bills of lading. I mean, it's possible to do. It just has to be done, because if it's not there in the contract, then there's nothing that you can rely on if something does go wrong.
Beth, now following what you are saying, do you think when there is a final version and it's final, would that be possible to make any corrections to it? Because it's an egg chicken situation. at the moment, we are, at least our parties are waiting because they don't know allegedly what will happen. So we are not affecting any changes. We are not affecting any proactively any implementation possibilities. Now we are waiting for the final. Final will descends on us. Then we will start saying, "Oh, sugar, we've got a problem, Houston." Is a way to appeal to those things in the European law, where we, as a lobbying party, are able to, or final is final. Now get on with it.
Oh, that's a really tricky question. I mean, I think once it's finally passed into EU law, it wouldn't be so much an appeal of the law itself, but a challenge to how it's being implemented that you'd be stuck with. So now is absolutely the time for putting in submissions. And I think there is there is some, well, flex is probably not the right word for it, but there was such a change between the second version and the most recent version that it was quite clear that a great deal of lobbying had taken place to make changes, and that's coming through. So I think the lobbying is being received. There is a reception, it's receptive to it, but you wouldn't normally wait until afterwards to start making comments about how you're unhappy with the situation. It needs to be done now.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rachel.
No, I was just going to say, in relation to that provision which imposes the opportunity to, or the obligation to impose the contractual provision, we were actually asked to advise on that at lobbying stage, so we'd seen that earlier than the third draft. And we don't particularly like it. Our advice was that that's not a particularly, it's a bit of an ugly way of dealing with it. But the point there is that the power of the organisations that were lobbying to have that provision in, the EU has listened to that. It was supported by various NGOs as well, because they saw that that was the way of getting ship owners on side with the legislation more broadly. So it just really makes the point that there has been quite a lot of lobbying and discussion, and there is that is being heard and listened to, and the drafts are changing as a result of that. So as Beth says, now is the time to be engaged in that discussion, because I think once it becomes final, it's final.
Thank you. And now there was also, Beth, in your presentation or in your speech, you smuggled the word insurance. And now we are trying, well, and insure, make sure, and so on and so forth. Are you seeing any insurance available on the market, any product which would actually allow third-party ship managers to insure themselves against, well, insure risks, and the risk being that for example, commercial operator goes belly up, that the owner of the cargo doesn't exist by the end of the year, and the risk of obligation falling on the third-party ship manager because of the contractual with owners, and so on and so forth. Are you seeing anything you could tell us, help, assist us with that?
Sadly, no. Again, everything seems to be very, very slow to respond to this. I think it is an issue which is discussed in terms of owners' P&I insurance. I'm not 100% sure on where that is going to fall, although I suspect, as with most regulations, it will follow the kind of P&I position that was adopted around the IMO 2020 sulfur regulations, where there is no cover, it's discretionary. So if we will help you if it's been accidental, we will will provide assistance, but where there's a deliberate problem and you're breaching it and you end up with a fine, then that is not our job, is not to insure you in those situations. I mean, I would hope that insurance products are being discussed and will come online. Again, none of them are likely to cover the consequences of deliberate breaches, but where there are accidental omissions or somebody or an insolvency, then there may be a product that becomes available to help there.
Excellent, Beth. I think I would like to pose, because I don't want to monopolize the floor, any other questions from our audience today. And ladies, thank you so much. Really good stuff. And I bet there will be far more hits on our YouTube channel once this is produced now, when people are seeing it, and especially, as I'm saying, because of the time constraints, when the US and Venezuela, Panama, and the other part of the world wakes up. But anyhow, I'm not seeing any yellow hands. I'm seeing absolutely silence on the floor. Very worrying. You probably overwhelmed us, to be honest.
There is one other reason I suppose I should throw in to try and start tackling the or at least the concept of the emissions trading scheme at an early stage, whether it's the EU one or not, in the sense that the EU proposal is by far the most advanced proposal. North America have said that they will be doing their own one, and the indication is that that will mirror whatever position the EU takes. China has indicated that it will be doing its own one. I think the UK is looking at its own one, which sets up a fairly hellish scenario of 3 to 4 separate schemes in operation, none of which will have to recognise the other. I mean, I think there is some hope that there will be a mutual recognition so that nobody's having to go around buying allowances all over the place. The IMO is due to start discussing a global scheme, but I think it's 2023 onwards that the discussions will start. So realistically, we're probably looking at later this decade before an international one comes in to replace the kind of different territorial ones, which are likely to pop up before the IMO's work there is finished. So as you'll see, if you look at the BIMCO clause, that is more broadly drawn than the EU one, and it's deliberately so to reflect that it's not just the EU who will be bringing this in. There are moves afoot for other regions to introduce a similar scheme. So that becomes more of a headache or an opportunity for managers if you're taking on the role of administering all of this. But you know, it certainly increases the need, I would say, to look at this more broadly than just say, well, the EU, and they've kicked it off for another year and they keep doing that, so it may be some years before this happens. It doesn't look like anywhere else is going to leapfrog them, but they might do. And you know, certainly if China decides that it wants to impose a trading scheme, it will be able to do so in pretty short order without the need for 27 member states to agree and different lobbying interests to be taken into account.
Beth, thank you. Rachel, would you like final word?
I was just going to add in relation to Beth's points, the UK government consultation is ongoing at the moment, and that's something actually that I'm involved in, and I don't know if it's on your radar as InterManager, but it might be something from a involvement point of view that you want to start getting involved in, and possibly the same in the other jurisdictions as well, as Beth has mentioned. So I just wanted to flag that for you.
Excellent. No, thank you. And again, once again, thank you. It wasn't short notice, but I think still a lot of work done for us. We really appreciate it. And you have spent some time on the third-party shipment matters. You can see, and obviously I can tell that you know our stuff as well, and you know where our headaches are. So it's just a matter of my members knocking on your door on particular issues and maybe help them to solve them. I think somebody is unmuted. Now, Dirk, you've got a question. Please go ahead.
First of all, thanks a lot for creating more awareness on upcoming problems to the two lovely ladies. I see that we have Grant Hunter in our group. I was wondering whether he has any comments to what we saw and heard today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sort of lurking in the shadows here because I joined very late. I just did put a little note at the end there. I know you've been talking about the exit clause and what BIMCO has produced today. It was just to say that we are looking at, we are currently revising Shipman, and the #1 priority task was to look at an exit clause. We've come up with a draft, and really, you know, as Beth has mentioned, you know, we can't really say for sure this is going to work until we get this sort of draft legislation finalised in the EU. So we have come up with something it's in our back pocket. We're not going to be sort of sharing it at this particular moment in time. I think there are meetings coming up this week or next week that might clarify things a little bit, but it is something we're working actively on, and we really know how concerned the ship management sector is about all of this. So yeah, it was just to sort of give you some positive note to this, that we are working on it, and you know, hopefully we do have something that will work for the ship management sector.
Excellent. That's the last sentence is extremely important. We know that BIMCO is always working very hard on owner's side. So making sure that ship managers are in line, it's always highly on agenda of BIMCO. Now my question is for my members, are we making sure that shipman actually works for the ship manager's side as well? And I need to participate. And Grant, I'm looking forward to getting your drafts for comments. For example, should you wish to involve stakeholders as well? It will be highly appreciated. As you can see,
yeah, we definitely do, Kuba. I mean, you know, this is a really important document for the ship management sector. ShipMan has been a very successful form. We want to keep it that way. We're looking at a number of updates and additional clauses kind of reflect the changes in the industry, but we absolutely want input from the stakeholders, the people who will be using this thing. So give us a little time. It's a little early days, but hopefully within the next few months or so, we might have something to share with you.
Absolutely great to hear that. Thank you. And Dirk, thank you very much, because Dirk is our ambassador on both sides, actually, for the ladies to understand BIMCO and ship manager. And I think this is the best way to go, working together, transparency, because shipping in the end of the day is one big family. So let's work together. Checking floor, not seeing any more flags. I am happy to close the meeting. Once again, dear ladies, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It was a superb meeting. I'm sure we'll have more hits later on today and days after. And with all of this, thank you. There will be another meeting in 14 days, and this time we will most probably concentrate on lifeboat accidents. And we will be presenting our project InterManager database on accidents involving lifeboats. More to come. I will be sending invitation and everything. And dear ladies, I will send you also, I will include you in my message with the link to the recording of this. So should you wish to spread the word, by all means, please use it. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks all.